What can the U.S. do to take a more aggressive policy stance in alleviating the conflict in Syria? The Secretary General's Special Envoy for Syria addressed the Security Council last month, saying constructive diplomacy is urgently needed in the midst of an intensifying humanitarian and security catastrophe that continues to brew in the 10-year conflict in Syria. The envoy said the ongoing airstrikes risk regional escalation and called on international cooperation to resist terrorist groups while also adhering to international humanitarian law. Since 2015, 11,000 airstrikes have been launched against the Islamic State in Syria by various nations. Actors such as Russia, Turkey, Iran, and the U.S. operate closely to each other, and the Committee on Foreign Relations says it's complicating the civil war and potentially creating unintended escalation. From January to March of 2020, Human Rights Watch cited 18 unlawful attacks that occurred in Idlib, killing 112 people and wounding 359. Two of those attacks that occurred on schools used cluster munitions. U.S. interests in Syria include eliminating the threat of terrorist groups, preventing the use of chemical weapons, mitigating the suffering of civilians, and helping the refugee burden on countries like Europe. According to Brookings, facilitating a phased process of easing U.S. and European sanctions is one of the next steps, but only when the U.S. and Europe have seen the Syrian government make progress on the steps they have negotiated on, which include civilian protection, countrywide humanitarian access, removal of chemical weapons, and genuine participation in the UN's Geneva process. U.S. policy must assume that the Assad regime will survive and move past hopeful pursuit that a political transition will occur. As stated by the Century Foundation, the best option is providing limited and targeted aid to Syria. Providing economic assistance without legitimizing the system can be done by working on smaller community-based initiatives such as supporting local communities and other community engagement programs to help IDPs and vulnerable youth cope with the effects of the conflict. It avoids complying with the regime directly and keeps a limited form of U.S. influence in the country. The U.S. must be strict on demanding significant improvements first before giving assistance, as think tank reports say it's time to put greater pressure. Leadership by the U.S. can help the UN, for example, be assertive towards the regime and needing to comply with donor pressure. The U.S. and Europe can minimize regional conflicts and create a level of international coordination. American Progress says the U.S. is one of the only Western powers that is actively shaping Syrian security dynamics and has the power to prevent a new round of fighting. Europe and the U.S. share interests in a stable democratic Turkey that can handle shared security challenges, but that will be undermined in the long run if it can't address the challenge of integration or the refugee zones along the border, quote, remain volatile exporters of insecurity. The first course of action in U.S. policy is preventing a new stage of conflict. The U.S. needs to strengthen the SDF relationship and expand it. Turkey needs clear warnings that further expansion in the east will be met with sanctions under Executive Order 13894. Russia and the regime also need warnings against not, quote, military probing along the deconfliction line. The U.S. should enhance internal security within respective zones and foster collaboration with Europe. Additionally, the U.S. needs to push the SDF to remove operatives from the military administration, ensure an autonomous government that represents the local population, and to continue reintegrating IDPs from camps and prisons. Paired with EU support, they can serve as a mediator in these initiatives. The second step is ensuring adequate humanitarian assistance. Longer-term humanitarian planning, increased stabilization efforts to restore basic services, and addressing issues leading to long-term instability can all be done with a more durable U.S. presence in the East. Turkey also needs better support and humanitarian assistance from the U.S. The United States must persuade Europe into providing more funding in the East, coordinating with funders to maneuver through political sensitivities, which can also be done through routing support through the U.S. By providing clear messaging, the U.S. can encourage others to also raise their commitments. A U.S.-Europe-led coalition should attempt to save the cross-border mandate and mobilize allies to pressure Russia at the UN. As a preemptive measure, the U.S. can hold a donor conference to start bringing together funds. Step 3 in the policy process is exploring conditional engagement options with Turkey. Turkey is in need of aid, and the U.S. and Europe must undertake efforts to ensure Turkish-controlled border areas don't become long-term areas of instability without legitimization. Step 4 is addressing external refugee issues. The U.S. should continue to bring in more refugees and, along with Europe, pressure Turkey to permit the UNHCR to freely monitor removal centers to guarantee all returns back to Syria are voluntary, as it's something written in Turkish law and promised by the capital city of Ankara. Ankara. Ultimately, the U.S. and Europe should work together to focus on harm reduction. President Biden has failed to adopt a new strategy for addressing the Syrian conflict, and the situation on the ground is worsening. Failure to appoint a special representative for Syria also signals to the country that this isn't a priority. If Idlib is taken back by the regime, it will deter the U.S. to find any political solution, and Assad won't have any incentive to negotiate.